making patent a classic war film's epic journey to the silver screen and allies against the rising sun, the United States, the British nations, and the defeat of Imperial Japan. His newest book, which he'll discuss tonight, has just been released. It's called Fan-in-Chief, Richard Nixon and American Sports, 1969 to 1974. In this breakthrough and well-researched book, Sarantakes argues that sports made Richard Nixon relatable to the American people, and it did so genuinely. Nixon loved sports, especially baseball and football. He could speak eloquently to experts in the sports media and talk strategy with coaches, players, and managers. Yesterday, we commemorated the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's seminal address to the silent majority, which you can view content at nixonfoundation.org. We have a documentary short, a podcast, and an online exhibit, which you can view there at nixonfoundation.org. In this speech, in this book, Sarantakes argues that the concept of genuineness and relatability through sports impacted Nixon's relationship with the so-called silent majority of Americans in many positive ways. The book also makes use of the Nixon White House tapes, as our distinguished speaker will describe. Noted Nixon tapes expert and Texas A&M University professor of history, Luke Nichter, says the following about Fan-in-Chief. In Fan-in-Chief, Nicholas Evan Sarantakes presents the Richard Nixon we never knew. Through his love of sports like baseball and football, we see how ordinary Nixon was even as President of the United States. This book is packed with names fans will recognize, and Sarantakes shows us how a shared love of sports is a universal language that brings people together. Before I introduce Professor Sarantakes to the stage, I want to play a short video that he and his team put together.
Don't worry, I'll be watching. Good luck now. So the fans, Mr. President, were fantastic.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library podium, Nicholas Evan Sarantakes.
Well, thank you for coming. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Nixon and sports. It's a bit of an odd topic, and basically what it is it's about Nixon and American sport. Nixon, basically, it was one of his few genuine hobbies was sport. He was a sports fan, and he was a genuine fan of the games of baseball and football. He didn't particularly care for a lot of other sports, although some did interest him a little here and there. Like most Americans, he was interested in the Olympics once every four years. And one of the things I should note is this was a project that was just plain old fun. I was getting to watch Nixon do things and interact with people that most presidents don't really interact with. The widow of Lou Gehrig or Roger Staubach or George Allen, and I was like, wow, it's nice to be president. And a lot of people ask, what are you trying? Is this Nixon and ping pong diplomacy? And then the short answer is no. This is really about Richard Nixon and domestic politics. And although, it was a fun project, being an academic, I try and answer the questions kind of seriously and say, okay, what was this all about? Why is this important? And really what I got down to is I want to answer a question that really intrigued me right after Nixon died, and saw this huge outpouring of affection for a man. And I was like, wow. I mean, a lot of my friends were like, did you expect this? Do you understand what happened? And I said, no, I didn't expect it. It was really a little bit flabbergasting. And Stephen Ambrose, the Nixon biographer, even talked about it on his, or at the funeral. He was part of the ABC team covering the broadcast of the funeral, and he said, "I just don't understand how this happened," and nor did I. So one of the things a serious question I wanted to answer was, why was Richard Nixon loved and hated? And like any politician is loved and hated, but so in one sense, no kidding. But on another sense, I can understand why Nixon was not loved by people because of the way he left office and all that sort of stuff. So that makes that part of the question obvious, but it makes the other part of the question even more obvious. And my answer to this is that he was popular because he found a way to present himself in a relatable manner to the American people. And that's not an easy thing to do because, first off, there's only one, you're in charge. I mean, being president of the United States is a daunting, intimidating job with a lot of responsibility. Some of you might be running businesses or in charge of departments, and that's a certain amount of responsibility, but man, being president of the United States, just think about all that. There are a lot of Americans. There are 200, 300 million of us, and we're a very diverse group, and how you relate to us or present yourself as one of us is a rather tricky thing, because there are some distinct differences between people who live in California and people who live in South Carolina and Maine versus New Mexico. So how did Richard Nixon do this? And one of the ways he did this was he interacted with sports in a way that most Americans could understand. And he did it in a way that made himself kind of one of us, but yet didn't surrender the authority of his office. So he kind of hit this nice kind of balance between these two different impulses. So that was kind of what I set out to do with the book. And I should start off by saying that Nixon liked sports. And this slide here shows you all the kind of sports he loved. He liked football, he liked professional football, and then please bear in mind that when he came into office, there were still two professional football leagues, the American Football League and the National Football League, which will merge in 1970 and just become the NFL that we know and love today. College football was another big thing. Professional baseball he loved. He loved to bowl. He loved race car driving. So these are some things that really interested him. Bowling was a big recreational thing for him. But there were also some sports that didn't really capture his attention, or things that he wasn't interested in a lot. He didn't really care for basketball. Basketball was different in the late 60s and early 70s. The college game was extremely popular. The pro game was not, even though there were two professional leagues. And part of Nixon's dislike of basketball was personal. He lost his two front teeth in a basketball game when he was in school. Those are caps, and you kind of understand why he might have been a little averse. Okay. He didn't really care for hockey. That really was, at that time, a Canadian sport, and maybe a northeastern U.S. sport, a Minnesota sport. Soccer wasn't catching on the way people thought it would. It was more of a participatory sport for school kids. He didn't like sailing. He didn't like tennis. There's actually a moment on the tapes when he's in one of his more darker moments where he's just saying, I tried the Olympics, and when I went to the 32 Olympics, and that was boring. Basketball, it's always going to be a high score. Who cares, you know? So and he went on and on about all the sports he liked and the ones that he didn't like. So, okay, but what is worth noting is that this is pretty typical for an American of his age and at that time, and I'd actually say for a lot of Americans even today, it's baseball and football. Throw in basketball, I mean, that's moved up in the world. Hockey maybe, but there are a lot of sports out there that don't have a broad and deep constituency in the United States. For example, rugby just played its World Cup, and I don't think many Americans paid attention to that. Now, what I thought I'd do is just kind of go through really kind of quickly what the book is about. And it starts with 1969, and there's an interesting transition. This is obviously Nixon comes to Washington, but so does Ted Williams, and so does Vince Lombardi. Yes, that Vince Lombardi. Ted Williams, who spent 20 years playing for the Boston Red Sox, is brought back to baseball after a 10-year absence and becomes the manager of the Washington Senators. This was a baseball team in Washington at the time, and the Senators, I want to say Redskins, the Senators were not known as a great baseball team. They were always a perennial loser. In fact, the original Senators left in 1960 and moved to Minnesota and became the Minnesota Twins. Washington, being the city of influence that it is, got a baseball team immediately the next year, so there was no break in baseball coverage in the city of Washington. And so the second Senators are this team, and they hired Ted Williams. And lo and behold, Ted Williams turned out to be a wonderful manager. There's this thing about great athletes being horrible coaches and managers. Well, it turned out Ted Williams took a bunch of everyday mediocrities, and this is a quote from a newspaper at the time, and turned them into solid hitters. They finished about third in the league. They had a winning record. It was the first time the new Senators had a winning record. And everyone was like, wow, look at this. Well, Nixon, the Senators were his team. He had lived in Washington off and on for the better part of 25 years, and he went to Senators games, and he didn't really make a difference between the original Senators and the new Senators, and he was finally seeing winning baseball. And he would go to the games, and he would just sit in the stands like an everyday fan. The first game he went to, of course, he throws out the first pitch, which is kind of what you expect of the President of the United States. But other than that, he didn't hang out in skyboxes. He didn't hang out in the dugout. He was just there in the stands. Of course, he was surrounded by Secret Service agents and everything else, but he made a show of inviting little leaguers to sit with him for an inning or so, and people made sorts of notes about how Nixon paid attention to the games, and Ted Williams was a fan. He had a picture of Nixon in the club locker room, and as you can see, on occasion, Nixon went to into the locker room after the games and congratulated the players. At the same time, the Washington Redskins decided that they had had enough of losing. They had had losing records for the better part of 20 years, and so they went and hired Vince Lombardi. And Vince Lombardi came to Washington and was the head coach of the Washington Redskins. It's the last job he had in football. And Nixon, Williams, and Lombardi were all brought in within a week of each other. So, and there's a great joke. This is the greatest transfer of power since last week. And that was used to describe Lombardi being brought in, because not only was he the head coach, he was the general manager and the vice president of football operations and everything else. So it seemed to be, 1969 seemed to be a great year, and Nixon took advantage of this. 1969 was also the centennial year of professional baseball. The Cincinnati Reds had been formed in 1869, so professional baseball decided this was their centennial. Okay, so the All-Star game was held in Washington, D.C. that year. And Nixon had this very interesting idea of, let's have a reception for all the All-Star players at the White House and all the former All-Stars who are going to be there. Now, this might seem like kind of fairly commonplace now, but in 1969, it was a brand new idea. And people are like, you're inviting Joe DiMaggio to the White House and Reggie Jackson, excuse me. Wow, how different, how weird. There's Mickey Mantle talking to, Whitey Ford about, all sorts of things. And people thought it was really odd, and the White House staff loved it. They're like, hey, I just got, Mickey Mantle's autograph. Now I'm going to go see if I can get DiMaggio's, So it was great. Now, the practice of inviting teams to the White House is now commonplace, but the person who started this up was Richard Nixon. Okay. Well, 1969 was also the centennial of of college football. So the Washington Redskins had a winning record, and Nixon became the first president to attend a regular season NFL game when he went to watch the Redskins one game. He also became the first and only president to watch an American Football League game. He went and watched the Dolphins play the Raiders to a 20-20 tie when he was at the Florida White House. But it was also the centennial of college football. And this is a subject close and dear to my heart because I went to the University of Texas as an undergraduate. That year, Texas and Arkansas were ranked 1 and 2 in the college polls. And back in the 1960s, the Southwest Conference was the conference that both those schools played in. And in the 1960s, the universities of Texas and Arkansas were basically what Alabama, big difference, what Alabama and Clemson are today, the dominant powers. Well, someone in the White House saw an article about college football in the South that was published in the New York Times, and had a great idea. He floated around and said, this talks about how important college football is to the South. And having lived in a number of southern states, I can tell you it is very important. And it does get very testy, when Alabama wins and Auburn doesn't. My cousin is a Baptist minister in Alabama, and he says it always creates problems the next day because people rub each other's nose in it and stuff like that. He always likes it when both schools win or both schools lose at the same time. So the memo basically said, if there's ever a chance for Nixon to go to do something in the South, look at a football game between two southern schools, preferably universities in two different states. So look for a big rivalry. Well, it turned out a month later, there's a perfect storm. Texas and Arkansas ranked 1 and 2. The game is played in Arkansas. There's a whole chapter on it. It's really exciting to me as the Texas Longhorn, but long story made short, Texas wins, and Nixon is there to give them a plaque declaring them national champs in the centennial year of college football. Well, there's a little bit of a problem. The Penn State Nittany Lions are also undefeated for the second year in a row. And Joe Paterno is like, who do I have to kill to get named number 1? And there's a little bit of a stink between Nixon and Paterno, and Nixon finally says, well, I'll give you a plaque for having the longest win streak, and Paterno says, well, we've already earned that. We've already discussed, no thanks. You're a busy guy. But this was fantastic. It was a huge success, and a good way of showing that is to show you the front page of the Los Angeles Times the next day. This is what was on the front page. That's Nixon giving a plaque, White House special plaque to Coach Darrell Royal at the University of Texas, basically that picture that was just up there. And this is the kind of coverage that it got. There was pictures like this in all the Texas newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, front page, sometimes above the fold, sometimes below the fold. But it was incredible media coverage. And H.R. Haldeman, the White House Chief of Staff, goes on in his diary about how great a coup this was with the sports fans. The thing with Penn State turned out not to be that big a deal. In fact, it actually kind of worked to Nixon's advantage. So wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So now, Chapter 3 is baseball and the Olympics. And one of the things I discovered in doing this research is that Nixon wanted the Olympics in the United States for the bicentennial year. And to make a long story short, to make sure that the Olympics came to the United States, or to be more specific, Los Angeles, the White House initiated a program of bribing members of the International Olympic Committee to vote for Los Angeles. Well, it didn't work for a whole host of reasons. The Nixon administration made a mistake of thinking, okay, well, the vote for the Panamanian delegate on the IOC, we'll just go talk to the Panamanian ambassador. What I've discovered is the International Olympic Committee doesn't work on those. It's more or less an international club. And yes, this guy is from Panama, but the ambassador from Panama or the foreign ministry of Panama or Italy or Ireland doesn't know who this guy is. And they oftentimes have no affiliations with their governments. So all this lobbying, telling the ambassadors of Belgium, you better make sure your guy on the IOC votes for Los Angeles, was a waste of effort. Nixon administration learned a little. They actually appointed a guy to run efforts, and there were actually reports sent to Haldeman, which was great. It was this long thing. Didn't work out. And one of the reasons it didn't work out is by this point in time, the Olympics had become very expensive, and very few cities wanted it. In fact, in the 1970s, only 3 cities during the entire decade, only 3 cities voted or made an effort to get the Olympics into their cities: Moscow, Montreal, and Los Angeles. And in 1970, with Moscow and Los Angeles kind of going at it, the IOC they weren't idiots. They're like, oh, we're stuck right in the middle of the Cold War. Let's give it to Montreal. Yay! And then the next time around, there were only 2 cities bidding for it: Moscow and Los Angeles. And it went to Moscow because Moscow had a better bid. I spent some time looking at the Olympic documents, and it was a better bid. And then the next time, when it came to decide who got the '84 Olympics, only 1 city bid for it. This was in 1978. Only 1 city wanted the Olympics. So anyway, so there's all this turmoil. At the same time, 1970 is a midterm election year. And Nixon decided one of the ways that he would kind of go about courting votes was to basically, go and campaign for people. And one of the neat things he did was he'd stop and when he was in Kansas City, he'd say, "How about them Kansas City Chiefs?" And everyone would go, "Rah." Okay, well, one of the things he did was he went to the 1970 All-Star Game. And you can see here what kind of media coverage he got when he went into Cincinnati in 1970. This is the front page of the Cincinnati Enquirer, huge coverage. He was interviewed during the game on, I believe it was NBC, and they talked about the importance of AstroTurf and how it sped up the game and stuff like this. And Nixon came across very authoritative, understood baseball very well, and again, great success for him. Okay. Another chapter on midterm elections. This is very important, so I spent a lot of time about this. The picture that you're looking there is basically midterm elections didn't go so well for Nixon. He made a lot of, originally the White House was very determined to be very controlled, and we're only going to visit these campaigns. We're not going to campaign for any congressmen, just senators. And as time went on, they lost control. And they started making all these appearances because party bosses said, well, you got to do this, you got to do that. Okay. Happens to every president. Nothing particularly great or unique about this. So at the end, it blows up in Nixon's face. The midterms go against the Republicans, which is kind of what you would expect, not that big a deal. The party in power generally tends to lose seats in the first midterm. So Nixon decides to give a conciliatory speech in 1970. And he decides to do this at the University of Nebraska. Okay. Why there? Well, it's a good Republican state in 1970, but also he wants to give another plaque to the national champs, and in this case, the Nebraska Cornhuskers. So this is basically a big reception that's held at the University of Nebraska campus. These are 2 of the captains on the team. He's giving them this plaque. It's basically identical to the one that they gave to the University of Texas the year before. And I forgot to mention this, Texas lost that plaque. Yes, it was a big story. They actually made a reproduction of it about a month ago. And the 50th anniversary of Texas winning the game in Arkansas is in about a month. And they've set up a new museum, and they wanted that plaque, and they couldn't find it, et cetera, et cetera. So it looks exactly like this one. And this was, suddenly everyone's like, wow, this was such a great speech, and it was so much better than all the speeches he gave in the midterm election. Well, I wish we could believe Nixon. That was the editorial response in some newspapers like the Washington Post. Okay. This appearance, though, is a great success because he's there presenting the team. There were certainly protesters, just the way is the case with any president, and it was very difficult for them to boo Nixon because the football team is right there, and it's like, come on, you're Cornhuskers. What's wrong with you? But I like this photograph here because it shows you how many people were there. This was like literally standing room only. Lots of people wanted to hear him talk, and it was a fantastic thing, and he went over very well. Okay. The Washington Senators no longer exist. They died again. And the next section of the book discusses the second death of the Senators. Washington does have a baseball team. They just won the World Series about a week ago, or not even that, like 3-4 days ago. Beat my Astros. But In 1971, the owner of the team, a gentleman by the name of Bob Short, decided that he could make more money selling the team to a group of investors that were located somewhere else. And this somewhere else was Dallas, Texas. So he basically said, the only way I can get Major League Baseball to sign off on this is if it becomes pretty clear that I can't stay in Washington. So he more or less intentionally tanked the team for the 1970 and 1971 seasons. Made a lot of horrendous, bad baseball decisions, trading for suspect players, trading good talent, young talent, away for aging stars. And even though Ted Williams was still there as manager, they returned to their traditional ways of losing. Okay. I did some research at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. Long story short, baseball did not want the Senators to leave D.C. Washington was a better baseball town than the town that Short wanted to move to, and that was Dallas-Fort Worth, for a whole host of reasons. More population in Washington than in Dallas, a better stadium. In fact, there was no stadium in Dallas at that time. They had to play in basically a glorified minor league baseball park for about 3 years, but Short wanted to go there because he had found investors who would buy the team, and he would make a profit. And then he basically scared his fellow major league owners by saying, if I stay in Washington, I'm dead, I'm bankrupt. Okay. Interestingly enough, this is the same tactics he used when he owned the Lakers. He bought them when they were in Minnesota and moved them to Los Angeles, same thing. So Nixon got involved in this through some happenstance. He was basically determined to kind of keep his hands off. The Senators were his home team, and he would have liked them to stay. And then Ron Ziegler, his press secretary, kind of made a fairly innocuous statement that the media quickly took to be, oh, Nixon's getting involved. And this forced Nixon to kind of say, I'm going to stay out of this. It'd be horrible, and that was enough. One of the reasons that Washington got a second franchise in 1961 was Dwight Eisenhower basically said, some of you baseball owners, well, you guys have bigger business interests at stake with the federal government, like you own airplane companies that make parts for Navy jet fighters, and if you want those contracts to continue, you better, make sure I have a baseball team to go see next year. Now, that probably was more bluff than anything else, but that's essentially what Ike said. Nixon basically says, So, anyway, the Senators leave for Texas and become the Texas Rangers. And baseball is scared because of their antitrust exemption. They're afraid Congress is going to take that from them. So members of Congress are start threatening to hold hearings and all this sort of stuff. Nixon's kind of like, hey, not my business. This is private business. And baseball makes a pledge. The next team that we create, next expansion team or next team relocation, will go to Washington. Okay, yay, all right. Except it doesn't happen. Baseball doesn't honor that pledge. Washington only gets a team when the Montreal Expos decide to leave Canada. So anyway, so the Senators are dead. All right, next I look again at football. This is a fun chapter. Nixon basically rooted for the Redskins. At the beginning of the baseball season, he goes to Canton, Ohio, the home of the Professional Football Hall of Fame, and does a televised special with Frank Gifford, who was just starting his tenure on Monday Night Football, so he's all nervous about interviewing the sitting president of the United States. The next night, Nixon gives a keynote speech just before the induction ceremonies of 6 people, including Vince Lombardi, and he spends a lot of time talking about Vince Lombardi. He did not give Lombardi's induction speech into the Hall of Fame. Some people say that, but it was this great speech. He talks about football as an example of the American way of culture and how it makes people strong and resilient and all this stuff. It's a great speech. I've read it many times, but to actually listen to it is incredible, and you start realizing that sometimes political rhetoric, political speech making is better when it's actually a speech instead of just read. But Nixon gives this, and then he goes and he cheers on the Redskins. He's holding a series of conversations with George Allen, the head coach. of the Redskins, and these are great. I listened to them. Listening to the tapes was so much fun, and listening to these conversations was great because you don't have to worry about, hand gestures or facial expressions. It's just two people on the phone. And every once in a while I was like, geez, Mr. President, the guy's a coach. He knows what he's doing. And Nixon's going, well, you got to do this and you got to do that. And be careful with this guy. It's Roger Staubach. He's really dangerous. There was a game where the Redskins got booed in their stadium. They lost to the Dallas Cowboys, and they actually got booed. So George Allen had extended an invitation to Nixon and said, if you ever want to come to one of our practice sessions, come. Well, Nixon said, I need to come and let them know they've done really good work binding this city together. So anyway, he decides to go to Washington Redskins practice. No one but basically George Allen knows he's coming. So these guys are hanging out, practicing, and suddenly they look across the field, and guess who's coming across with a bunch of Secret Service agents and a bunch of newspaper reporters. And it's like kind of electric. He spends about 20 minutes, he gives a speech, he says, listen, don't worry about them guys in the stands booing you. You've been good for this city, and I watched you. You guys didn't give up. You kept fighting, and you kept fighting. And you're going to go. You're going to get back in the playoffs. I believe in you guys. Well, it made the front page of the newspaper. Not the front page of the sports section, front page of the newspaper. And the Redskins do exactly what he says. They make this comeback. They get into the playoffs. It doesn't go well for them. They end, and he says, okay, well, I'm going to root for the Dolphins in the Super Bowl. Okay. Well, doesn't go well for the Dolphins. They are up against the Dallas Cowboys, and they lose, and Dallas fans ridicule him and all this sort of stuff. Nixon's like, oh, okay, well, great. So, but again, fantastic coverage. He makes some phone calls late at night, calls Don Shula. This leaks to the media, and it suddenly gets reported that he's designing football plays. He's not. He just said, you might want to throw this, but there are plenty of news stories that actually are diagramming X's and O's. Nixon never did that. He just said, you might want to throw to this guy. Okay. This is a better picture of that Redskins practice session. At the end, Nixon poses with the players and coaches. Chapter 7. He basically, in 1972, holds a press conference, and a reporter says, Mr. President, can you name your greatest baseball players of all time? And he says, well, yes, I'd put so-and-so at first base, and then so-and-so, and then so-and-so. And the problem is that he names like 3 first basemen, and he says, oh, well, this is kind of difficult. And then the reporter says, well, if you had a week, could you do it? And Nixon says, sure, I'll do that. And that's exactly what he does. He spends a week putting together his greatest baseball players of all time list. And I asked myself, why in the world would a president of the United States spend 7 days putting together this list? I get fantasy baseball is fun, but you've got other things, more important things to do. And I looked at the list. I said, wait a minute. Well, there's the guy who's Puerto Rican. There's the guy who's Polish. There's the guy who's... And I said, wait a minute. This list was released in July 2nd, 1972. What else happens in 1972? An election year. And in fact, one person did notice, if there isn't an ethnic voting group that isn't represented on this team, it's not a very important one. What he did, instead of creating these are the 9 greatest players of all time, the greatest first baseman, the greatest second baseman, he basically says, I'm going to create a team for the American League and the National League, before the war and after the war. And I'm going to also have some reserve players. So he names a lot of people. And it goes over very well. I spent some time tracking how it was covered in the cities that had baseball teams in 1972. Some people, like Indianapolis was not a baseball city even today, but you can see they put this on the front page of the paper, above the banner. Not the front page of the sports section, the front page of the paper. Other papers that you wouldn't think would be that friendly to Richard Nixon, like the Boston Globe, give him an entire page. It's on the front page. Sometimes it's listed under his byline. Oftentimes it's with photographs of the players. It is an incredible media PR win for him. And one of the things I discovered is that there is a constant interaction between Nixon and sports reporters. In fact, there's one time he calls up a Washington Post sports reporter at his home and says, "I read your article in the Post yesterday. I think you're wrong. Pedro Ramos is going to be a great acquisition for the Senators." And the guy goes, "Mr. President, thank you for calling. You're wrong." No. I remember so-and-so, and he still had games left on him after he turned 30. I said, "Yeah, okay." And the reporter reports this, okay? Well, I saw the same thing in the Green Bay paper, the same thing in the Akron paper. And people, sports reporters in these, I don't know how to call them without sounding derogatory, but, not in Washington, not in the national media outlets, but, big media outlets, but not, people interact with the president every day. But they get this chance to report on Nixon, and they give Nixon incredibly good media PR attention, and Nixon doesn't have to do anything political to get this attention. And in fact, it's in the sports sections, which in some cases are better read than the news sections. Okay. So this is what happens with the 72 election, or 72 All-Star team. Now what's interesting about this, okay, is he gives an interview to the reporter. The guy's name was Cliff Evans, and he was a reporter for RKO Radio. And the interview was captured on the White House tapes. And what's interesting about this is he really opens up. He talks about some of the guys he picked. And one of the guys that he picks is a player who got really sick with tuberculosis and overcame it and actually returned and played Major League Baseball. And I've always thought that the death of Nixon's brother had a big impact on him. And in this interview, he basically opens up and says it did. It's one of the few, it's the only time I've actually ever seen it. I know John Farrell in his biography really makes this point, and if you watch the Nixon movie that Oliver Stone made, he equates the death of Nixon's brothers with the deaths of the Kennedy brothers. I think the Kennedy brothers' death tells you more about Oliver Stone than it tells you about Nixon, but I think Stone was onto something about Nixon's brothers and what kind of impact that had on him. John Farrell makes that argument. This is where Nixon actually admits it in public, and it's the only time I've seen it where Nixon comes out and says it point blank. So some really interesting insights there into the man. Okay, Chapter 8 follows the story of the election without the baseball team. There's some things that happen in the second half of 72. Denver votes not to hold the Winter Olympics in 1976, and that catches the Nixon White House off guard, and then they say, oh, it doesn't matter. There's the Olympic tragedy where the Palestinian terrorists killed the Israeli team. Nixon basically offers support. It turns out that's more all he does, but there still is raising funds for memorials, etc. There is still finishing off the election. So all this stuff happens in that chapter. And then we get to the last chapter. And one of the things that really hit me in looking at the documents is that the White House organizationally starts to fall apart once Haldeman leaves. And we all know Haldeman is basically fired in April of 73 in the wake of the Watergate scandal, along with Ehrlichman and a couple other people. And he's replaced by Alexander Haig as chief of staff. And Nixon's interaction with sports comes to a very dramatic end. And the last thing he really does is he interacts with the Washington Redskins. They get into the Super Bowl, their first Super Bowl, but they're up against the Miami Dolphins. And he had rooted for the Miami Dolphins the year before. That's a part-time resident of Florida. I got to vote for the Dolphins. Okay, well, the Dolphins lose to the Cowboys in that Super Bowl. Next year, 73, the Dolphins are a team of destiny. They're undefeated, and the Redskins are there, and he says, no, I'm going with the Redskins. Well, Redskins lose. Dolphins finish undefeated, the only time in NFL history that's happened. And boy, did Miami fans just really kind of rub it in Nixon's face. They're driving past his residence and honking horns and all this sort of stuff. And anyway, Nixon eats a certain amount of crow with good grace. The other thing that happens almost at the same time that the NFC and AFC championship games happen is that Roberto Clemente, outfielder for the Pittsburgh Pirates, is basically organizing a charity mission to send relief supplies to Nicaragua after an earthquake. And he basically is not content just to write a check or to show them on a telephone. He actually is the organizational person behind this. And to make sure the supplies get there and not pilfered by the Nicaraguan army, he decides to go on the airplane with the supplies. Well, turned out, while he might have been a really great human being, a great humanitarian, he knew very little about picking a good airplane. And he picks actually a very incompetent pilot with an airplane that is not particularly well maintained. Long story made short, the plane crashes minutes after it takes off in the waters off Puerto Rico. And of course, he's killed. This is a huge event, really hits people hard. Baseball changes the rules and votes him into the Hall of Fame almost immediately. And one of the things that Nixon does is he basically leads the nation in mourning. He supports legislation to create a Roberto Clemente gold medal, and this is basically the front and back of the gold medal. There are about 2,000 of these coined, and the sales go to raising funds for the charity. And he also awards Clemente the first Presidential Citizens Medal, the very first one, for basically distinguished service. And there's a big ceremony in the Oval Office in May of 73. His widow, his kids, his brother show up, etc. Very moving. And this really represents pretty much the end of Nixon's interaction. Watergate starts to consume all of his attention, understandably so, and that's basically where the book comes to an end. And with that, I will basically bring my presentation to an end, unless some of you nice people have some questions.
Thank you, Nick. Nick has agreed to take your questions. I just want to also announce that Fan-in-Chief is available for purchase in the museum store, and Nick will sign them after the event. I have a question. Who was President Nixon's, which baseball player and football players specifically did he have most interaction with throughout his presidency?
Well, when it comes to players, it's hard to pick one. It's pretty limited. With coaches, it's easy to answer. It's George Allen and Ted Williams, a lot. He calls, again, George Allen is a person who Nixon can call late at night and just talk. And he doesn't have to talk about, policy issues, wetland issues, or, the EPA bill. He just talked about football. And he loved George Allen. One of the reasons he loved George Allen isn't that he's coach of the Redskins, although that was part of it. George Allen's first head coaching job was at Whittier College, Nixon's undergraduate alma mater. And then Don Coryell becomes the head coach of the then St. Louis Cardinals. Coryell, first head coaching job, Whittier College. So Nixon's like, hey, yeah. Now, he doesn't have that kind of relationship with Coryell, but that's, of the players, those are the, well, I shouldn't say players, of the sports figures, those are the two. When it comes to athletes, I would say that there are a number of people he liked meeting, interacted with a lot. It's hard to say. There were a lot of people who made appearances throughout his presidency, but there's not any one person who shows up athlete-wise over and over again.
We have a question right here.
Talk to us a little bit about Title IX and his involvement in that.
Yeah, that's a serious one. Title IX is legislation that he signs into law in 1972, and it's still in effect today. And basically what Title IX is it basically is a civil rights bill basically for education and gender. So basically what Title IX has the effect of doing is basically it brings about is too strong a word, but it basically requires that colleges and universities start investing money and resources in women's athletic programs in addition to men's athletic programs. So that's why in the second half of the 70s and the 80s you see women's sports programs, women basketball teams, softball teams, track teams, etc., growing at colleges and universities across the country. And the Nixon Ford administrations basically say, work out some rules where basically it's, if you're going to have 100 scholarships in men's sports, you have to have 100 scholarships in women's sports, and so forth. And this has been worked out a little bit in a number of lawsuits, et cetera. And there's something also about how many teams you have and how much you pay coaches, et cetera. So Nixon signs this into law. Nixon thought the legislation was not a good idea. but he signs it. And he signs it even though he has profound reservations about what it's going to do to football. And there's some, if you literally read the legislation, it seems to say you will have, there will be girls and guys on the same teams. Now, that's not the way it gets implemented, but that's a whole different story. But Nixon looks at this and says, this is horrible. This is horrible. This will kill college sports as we know it. But Nixon has an election to win in 1972. And he's not about to veto any civil rights bill. And ultimately, as some of the people say, the idea was to create opportunities for women and not necessarily kill off the men's soccer team or the men's lacrosse team. So Nixon sees this, he's not fond of it, but he signs it anyway. So it's one of those, I'm really worried about some of the consequences, but there are more important things to think about. So that's basically his involvement with the legislation. I know Sports Illustrated once called him the godfather of women's sports. That seems a little bit generous, or a lot generous.
We have a question right here.
Oh, okay. No. Well, I'll get both of them. Okay.
Well, I actually have two questions. One sport you haven't mentioned, which is sort of associated with a lot of presidents, is golf.
Yes.
And particularly Richard Nixon's mentor, Eisenhower, is like completely associated with golf, and like Donald Trump's obviously avid golfer to a certain extent in his second term, Barack Obama. I get the impression that Nixon really wasn't much of a golfer. And then my second question is, it seems now that, and I guess it all goes back to Richard Nixon, how we have to have every sports team come to the White House. And I'm curious if you've been able to research how many, I mean, Richard Nixon genuinely was a sports fan. I'm curious as to how many maybe other presidents really were or were not, and this is all sort of a somewhat cynical play at politics.
Well, there's so many responses to that. So first, golf. It's in the book. Nixon was not a huge golf guy at first, but he grew to like the sport, and he actually had golf clubs waiting for him at Camp David. He had them waiting at the California White House. He had them in his Florida residence and all this sort of stuff. The issue became, where could he golf? And the White House staff didn't want him golfing at certain country clubs that discriminated or prevented certain groups from joining, Jews, African Americans, etc. So that became an issue. If this guy wants to do that and he's a private citizen, well, that's unfortunate, but that's his business. But the President of the United States can't go to these kind of places. So that is there. And you're right, basically it's the sport of presidents. We expect all our presidents to be able to golf, and Nixon did. I've heard different, he wasn't particularly, how do I put this? He wasn't a physically dexterous individual, but he got okay at it. But some people said he took a lot of mulligans, which are, little do-overs that don't count. So I ultimately came down to the side on he did better at the game than people gave him credit for. Now, maybe that's just a homer call. I like Nixon. So the second question was on all the appearances. Well, Nixon invents this practice. And at the time, it seems really odd. And in fact, he invents the practice of calling people after they win the big game. First time he did that was with the U.S. Open in 1969 when an amateur actually won the golf tournament. The first team that he does that for is the New York Mets, the amazing Mets of '69. And it's still, it's a brand new practice. And people are just like, the president's on the phone? Hello, Mr. President, thank you for calling. Why are you calling? Yay, thank you, yes, it's a big deal. And in fact, it's so new that John Wooden, who's the head coach of the UCLA Bruin Bears basketball team, and they win 10 championships in 12 years, right through the time that Nixon's in office. Wooden says the biggest honor in his coaching career was actually getting a phone call from Nixon after they won. And he's actually in tears by the end of that conversation. So He invents that practice. He invents the practice of inviting people to the White House. Now, it falls by the wayside under Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter for the most part. Jimmy Carter invites the 1980 Winter Olympic team to the White House after the Lake Placid Olympics. Originally, he just wanted the hockey team there. But then people say, well, you really have to invite everyone. So, and they were like, okay, well, the hockey team and Eric Heiden, and people forget this, but we only won 6 medals, gold medals at the 1980 Olympics, 6. 5 by Eric Heiden and 1 by the hockey team. But then it's like, well, okay, yeah, these guys who got the silver and bronze, and okay, everyone. And then under Ronald Reagan, it just becomes a tradition. So it's a little of both. It's a little genuine, hey, I get to rub shoulders with people who are cool. And I certainly, I wrote a book on the 1980 Olympic boycott, and I looked at the photographs that were taken by White House photographers at the reception for the Winter Olympic team. And it's, some of those guys are really trying to like, hey, I'm important at the White House. And, you know, they're trying to impress other people of the opposite gender, and some of them are like, okay, so anyway. So there is some of this genuine, hey, I'm getting to mix with sports legends, and this is cool, and some of this is an opportunity to just be cynical and manipulate someone who's got a lot more media attention. It's a little of both. And I would say with the presidency being such an inherently political job, but yet also supposed to be the head of state and this unifying symbol, it's a tricky balance of hitting both things at the same time. And at least for a while, Nixon seemed to hit that balance. So, sir.
Anything you came across in your research during the Nixon presidency on the Angels, our hometown team? He was close to Gene Autry, and I know after he left office, he attended a number of Angel games, but more of a Senators fan rather than the hometown team for him, which would be the Angels. Anything that came up in your research on the Angels?
Yes, very much so. Basically, presidents would throw out the first pitch at Senators games because they're in D.C. And this was started under William Howard Taft, and it was basically, you know, it was part of a marketing effort made way back in, you know, 1910, you know, trying to make, you know, baseball the American pastime, and it worked. Okay, well, the Senators leave, okay? The Texas Rangers say, you're welcome to come pitch, throw out the first pitch, and Nixon's attitude is, yeah, okay, whatever. So he decides to adopt a new practice. He says, I will now throw out the pitch at my home team. And he just declares, with the Senators gone, my home team is the California Angels. And he becomes the first U.S. president to throw out the first pitch at a stadium outside of Washington, D.C. And he does that the next year. Well, actually, I think it's the year after because I think there's a strike, if memory serves me. But he does it with the Angels. And Nixon is a geographic vagabond throughout his life. We know that he lives in Washington a great deal of time because, you know, he's senator, congressman, senator, vice president, then president. And then he moves to California, and then he moves to New York, then he moves back to California, and then he moves to New York, New Jersey. So he kind of says, I root for whoever I root for wherever I live. So when he's in New York and New Jersey in the 70s and 80s, he's a Mets fan. But in the 70s, after he leaves office, he's an Angels fan. So he is rooting for the Angels, and he had that kind of dexterity. He's not a die-hard fan of, you know, like I have cousins who are, if they grew up in Pittsburgh, one of them no longer lives in Pittsburgh, but they are Steeler Pirates fans to the end. And I was like, okay, great. Yeah. You know, I've lived all over, and I just don't have that physical dexterity that Nixon did. But the Angels are his team, at least while he's after the Senators leave, and in the 70s after he leaves office.
Anybody he didn't like? Any teams that came out that he really despised for a particular reason? Maybe because it was a particular city or...
Right. There is a rather candid conversation with him and Haldeman about why he's not going to root for the Dodgers. So, and he felt one of the reasons was he felt would get a better reception in Orange County than he would get in Los Angeles. So that's definitely a team that he's not rooting for. But I don't really see, that kind of animosity of like, I hate this team, I'm not going to ever root for him. That didn't seem to be his thing. He was, and in one sense, when we get back to cynical politics, that would not be good cynical politics. It's like, I hate the Yankees. It's like, no, he seemed to be pretty flexible, and it's, like whoever's winning and he kind of has an association with. But with that said, he rooted for the Senators for a long time, even when they were really bad. So I think in one sense, if he were around today to watch the Nationals win a World Series, he'd be happy. It's like, oh, I've lived in Washington, and it's good for Washington, and so forth. So, but the only team I can really think of that he said no to was the Dodgers.
Thank you very much. Please give Professor Sarantakes a round of applause. Fan-in-Chief is available for purchase in the museum store, and Professor Sarantakes will sign it for you in the Annenberg Court. Thank you very much for coming, and please check back for future events at nixonfoundation.org. Thank you.